Hi, my name's Dee and welcome to Sunchild Tarot. Now, it's not the standard tarot reading video. We can all admit that this year, 2020, has been extreme. Let's put it that way. And we're all led to believe that it is Capricorn's fault. So I have with me astrologer David Fischer. So David, tell me, why is it all Capricorn's fault?
Hello, Darren. Good morning. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, it's Capricorn's fault in a way. It's just that the planets and the signs, they reflect really what's going on with us down here. We have given them that that purpose since they are there. And the thing is, Capricorn is being very much disturbed right now by a few of the inhabitants of the sky. Let's put it that way. You have the planets moving about in signs, and they make those signs more active and more agitated while they're going through them. And the significations of those signs, when the planets are going through them, just become exaggerated, and we see more of it more prominently in society. So it's kind of Capricorn's fault, because there's some planets in Capricorn that move pretty slowly, that have been there for the past 12 years. And so we are feeling that energy, that part of the sky a lot, and that doesn't happen all the time. Pluto, for example, is the one that I'm talking about that ingressed Capricorn last in 2008. The previous time Pluto ingressed into Capricorn before 2008 was in 1770s, 1760s, somewhere like that. And it's one of the most known pieces of history that we have as a result of that transit was the American Revolution, for example. That this United States of America, its independence chart, it's having its Pluto return for the first time since we had the independence of the United States. You go backwards in the cycle of Pluto, and you have the great ships coming into the Americas and colonizing Americas. They had discovered it during the Pluto and Scorpio, but the more intense part of the colonization process began happening about 20 years after the 1500s here in Brazil, for example, which is where I am from. And so you have these connections with great pieces of history, important events that define generations, because the largest structures of society were expanding. In a way, they were being destroyed, they were being reconfigured because of new distributions and political fights over territory. Who would have more power over those lands? Where would that power lie? Would that power lie in the exploring of the land as in agriculture, or would we explore it as in mining? How would we explore those lands? All those questions, and who would dominate which land in the Americas, really defined the conflicts back then in society in a lot of major ways when you're talking about the Western culture. So that ought to say that these previous Pluto cycles through Capricorn really redefined society as a whole in a very important manner. It brought to our awareness, while the sign was being activated and agitated by that energy, new information and new power dynamics that really redirected society in major ways. It reestablished what is the new norm, which is a Capricorn word, norm, structure. What is the new establishment? Those things tend to change when Pluto goes over Capricorn. So, not only when Pluto goes over Capricorn, but when it challenges Capricorn in any way, when it's in Cancer, Libra, or Aries, it will challenge those established orders in Capricorn in that way. But when it's going through that sign, it tends to make old structures crumble to give way to the new ones. Why am I talking about Pluto here? Because it's the slowest moving planet, and so it gives you the largest perspective of all of the planets that inhabit Capricorn during this period, about what should we be looking for during this period of time in society. You know, okay? Do you want to say something?
would I be right in saying, you said 2008, Pluto into Capricorn, we have the subprime mortgage crisis that led to a great financial crash.
Exactly,
And
yes.
that's Pluto saying, hi, honey, I'm home.
Well, part of it, yes. But there is this thing that before Pluto could ingress into Capricorn, it was entering to Jupiter, still in Sagittarius by the end of that sign. And Jupiter did ingress into Capricorn during 2008. And it was in a conjunction to Pluto when the crash happened.
Right.
So that development, that when both of them ingressed into Capricorn in December 2008, by the time Pluto actually ingressed into Capricorn, Jupiter was still there, and more about that in a moment because it's important. But Jupiter was there, and it had already been activating that area of the sky, making it more agitated before Pluto stepped into it. But they were already linked. The things that it was treating in Capricorn had already happened in the conjunction back by the end of 2007 in Sagittarius. So, since Pluto started going over Capricorn in 2008, we had Obama being elected in the Americas. We started having so many scandals here in Brazil, for example, in politics, around the people who were in power being too corrupt to be in power, and how they actually really ruined a lot of things in an economic sense. But that's because the majority of the economic scenario worldwide was already a shit show of sorts.
Yeah.
Excuse me, my language. But all of that was showing to the public how our society in general needs to redirect itself, how we need to take our new Republican ideas, which are relatively new in a modern sense. How do we take that to the next level? Because we have reached this new question mark of, wait, the new structure is not serving us anymore. The new structure is seeing a downfall because we are seeing this new surge of ideas, this new surge of culturalism that has come up with this new globalized culture that we are developing.
Yeah.
The times need to keep up, and the tradition doesn't generally keep up. And what Pluto does when it comes into Capricorn is bring down those traditions that are not keeping up with the times, and that are trying to pull back the times. Sometimes, unfortunately, they managed to adapt, and they kept some, for example, the autocratic powers didn't crumble every time Pluto was in Capricorn, right? Yeah. Only some specific ones. But since we have been having these more and more as a reflection of Pluto in Capricorn, of autocracy and centralized power being redistributed, we can see that this is going to happen now again. We see new patches of populations of minorities that used to be called minorities. Now we are going to have from now on to acknowledge them as not minorities anymore, because they are just people reaffirming their rights to exist and to contest the power dynamics that are on top of everything, especially because that's what you're supposed to be doing if you live in a republic anyway, isn't it? Yeah. It is about the democracy. It is about the public and what they decide is going to happen. Even for people that still live, for example, here in Brazil, we live in a republic. You guys in the United Kingdom live in a, sorry about that. You guys in the United Kingdom live in a constitutional monarchy. Yeah. So the constitutional monarchy is still the powers of the monarchy, of the establishment, the state, being measured against the powers of the population and what the population wants, right? It is a marriage of powers there. And that should also have some see some alterations, see some change, see some turnings of tables, whereas at some time in the past we thought some things were impossible with the monarchy. Nowadays we see its face change there in the UK, as we see the face of the Republic here in Brazil changing a lot. We had, with Pluto in Capricorn, our first woman president, for example, and it was from a left-wing party here in Brazil, of sorts, still quite capitalistic dynamic, but kind of a left-wing party here. And she was deposed, right? She was deposed by a right-wing, by a more right-minded kind of character person that later on gave place to the current government, which is much more restrictive and against all of the things that we have advanced on in the previous decades, which was environmental change for the better. We were going in a good direction here in Brazil, for example. And in the previous 2 years, with this new, more conservative government, we have been seeing here, for example, some retrogradation into the days where you could just kill half of the Amazon and no one would say shit about it, because you were just improving capitalistic ideals, right? Yeah. No matter how that would affect the environment. But now we know better, and these governments have no place. These kinds of, not these governments, maybe they do in a way, but if they can adapt their speech, which they haven't been able to do so far, right? Yeah. To the current needs of the current scenario. And Pluto is here to tell us and to show us through these very harsh circumstances, which by necessity, which things society needs to grasp power in order to change, you know?
Yeah.
And it's always about how, because it's Pluto, it's about generations of people that are born under that influence, that have that kind of energy inserted into their psyche when they're growing up, and they grow up with it. They develop their own thoughts and ideas that are new because they are young about that scenario that they grow up in. And so the generations of people that have Pluto in Capricorn really grow up knowing about these power dynamics. This generation was the generation that gave place, for example, the last cycle, when it was in Aquarius and subsequently in Pisces, to the new government that would fill up the gap that was left by the previous structure that had fell.
Yeah.
So that's how things are going to develop, but more on that in another time. We are focusing here more on Capricorn.
So Pluto is only 2/3 of the way through Capricorn. It's about 22, 23 degrees. Are you saying that we can expect this 2020-ness to carry on while Pluto is going all the way through Capricorn? Because it started with the Great Recession, and then it wasn't too bad for a while, and then it turned crazy again. I mean, will 2020 end, or can we expect 2020 to end sometime in like 2036?
But that's the thing about the larger planetary cycles. You see, you have to consider also the innermost planets from Pluto to see how that larger image that I was giving in the last cycles with this one would integrate. You have to look at, for example, Uranus, Neptune, and then Saturn, and then Jupiter, to understand how society is really dealing with that dynamic that Pluto, the slowest of them all, is dictating. Mm-hmm. So no, it's not going to be always like that. For example, 2022, we have both Saturn and Jupiter very well dignified in the sky, and that generally is not so bad for society in general. And for Pluto stuff, since Pluto is in Capricorn, its ruler, Saturn, would be giving it good resources to go on about its business. So we don't need to expect as crazy a scenario as we have been seeing in 2020, but we have been seeing what we have been seeing now because of all the pressure that sign is having. Remember I said in the beginning that when a sign is being activated, is getting all the action possible from those planets.
Yeah.
And it's really like a party. When you have a party at your house, you have the people invited in, and then there's the start of the party, how you feel in that moment, how you're feeling midway through the party, how you are enjoying it. And then towards the end of the party, you're already thinking about when people leave, if you're going to leave things for the morning, or if you are going to have to organize everything after the leave, you know?
Yeah.
So it's much like that. Now we are getting to that moment where we kind of can see the end of the party coming, and we start kind of, okay, how are you going to address these things that we need by necessity right now, so we can guarantee that when the time comes to leave, for Pluto to leave Capricorn, these subjects are already in the way to the next thing, you know?
Yeah. So you're saying that there is hope, and that 2020 is going to end not just sometime this century, but sometime reasonably soon.
Reasonably soon, yes. We are fearing and we are seeing several repeats that repetitions that we might not like so much nowadays. For example, people being, we're seeing horrors previously depicted by society in other times being brought up by this resurgence of conservatism and really policies that try to keep things under control, but it's not a kind of control that fits anymore into the molds of the societal structure that we are remaking now, that we are rebuilding.
Yeah.
So it's going to end sometime soon, because we are already seeing how, because of the pandemic and all the things that have been happening in Capricorn this year, depicting the pandemic, have been forcing society to change abruptly into another direction in several of its sectors. You know, that could go into some people's liking and become some progressive change, but it can also mean that more conservative powers simply take over more deeply. They take over more. What's a good word for when things take a better hold of something?
Become more entrenched.
Yeah, they become more entrenched.
So on that note, I've heard on a few of the astrologers' shows that Saturn in Aquarius is not necessarily the whole woo-woo age of Aquarius, love and light, and everything's going to come up roses, but could actually be the hardening of right-wing authority upon the face of the planet. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I terrified for no reason? You know,
No, definitely. It could be definitely could be a hardening of authoritarianism, because you have an Aquarius is a fixed sign and it's ruled by Saturn. And Saturn, in this traditional approach, which is the one I refer to for those modern astrologers out there that might use another system, it really represents this imposing of your ideals, because you need to reinforce it upon the current ideal. So Saturn can as easily be the rebel that wants to go against the oppressive scenario that they live in, as much as they can be the dictator that rebel becomes once they come into power. We have seen that happen several times before in the past, haven't we? With revolutionaries like Lenin and Stalin, and we have seen Cromwell even reestablishing his power as a king in the UK once he established the, how do you call it, that period of the Regency, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. Or something like that. So we have these rebel figures that do relate to Aquarius. But Saturn is the ruler, and it's a fixed sign in the system that I use, and that's the application that you have to think it through.
There is one point about Saturn, though. Well, 2 points I want to make about Saturn. If we're looking at the myth of Saturn, if you think about it, Saturn, Kronos, was the first rebel because he rebelled against his father Uranus.
Precisely.
And he also presided over a golden age on the planet. So Saturn is not necessarily all bad and nasty.
Yes, you're right. It's just that it's a different feel from Jupiter, but it's not that we are going back into a Saturnian age in a sense that you just mentioned of the golden age of Saturn. But we are going to see people radicalizing much more on their own point of view. We have seen people before in history, several points in time where you had these distributed power dynamics in the world, like the Byzantine Empire. You had other empires around it that traded with it, and it was a very central part of trade, but it was like power dynamics with other powers at the time also. And then you see the Byzantine Empire finally fall within an age that people were expanding the notions of what was possible and how society could work, what power was really about, and how it could redistribute it. And we are seeing now some calls to that in society when you see minority, quote unquote, because they're not really minorities, they're a really large number of people claiming their rights in much more radical ways. We have already seen that happening just this year, right? Yeah. Because of all these planets concentrating their energy in Capricorn, and those power structures not being able to cope with the abundant amount of energy that is being put upon them, at the same time. So they cannot hold up their previous mass control strategies the same way they used to, The conservatives cannot hold up their power with those strategies, and let alone actually rule something, actually do something that's good for the adapting to this new scenario.
So would you say some of that energy has come from like the number of larger outer planet conjunctions going on in Capricorn this year? We've got 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions because of the retrograde motion. We've had the Mars-Jupiter conjunction. Now, is the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction going to be Capricorn or Aquarius?
It's going to be a 0 Aquarius already. We are in an air age. Actually, we are in a cusp of a new air age now, as it's called.
Just to explain what that's about.
Yeah, we have been changing cycles. So there are larger planetary cycles, one specific to Jupiter and Saturn that happens every 20 years and changes elements of signs, which means air, earth, fire, and water, every 200 years. So it's one larger cycle of 20 years inside another larger cycle of 200 years that these two planets follow with each other.
Right. So we would have all of the conjunctions in air signs or earth signs, and we're
exactly. And now, exactly. And now, this is not about what you hear about the Aquarius age. This is another subject that I'm not touching on specifically now too deeply, but we are going to see more of air qualities in society now that Saturn and Jupiter moved their larger cycle of 200 years into that elemental air triplicity of Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. That's what it means. It's only going to happen every 20 years in one of those 3 signs for the next 200 years. And that has been shifting since the early 80s, since 1980, actually. And that shift was the introduction of the internet and the devices inside that cycle that would define much of what we know now as the globalized society.
Right.
And that's a very big characteristic of this new age that we are coming upon. The last one saw the the Crusades. So a lot of religious conflict around ideals, which ideal was right, people masking their good intent, their own intents, their own evil intents for their own greed for power, with religious intent, sending people to colonize other lands, and hungering for those new lands because they needed power distribution. They needed to redistribute power among powerful families that were getting larger and larger and didn't have much to distribute their heirs.
Yeah.
And so they just became knights that needed to do something for their country, you know. And so idealism, patriotism, extreme patriotism. So a rise of conservatism is not out of the picture, but it can also mean that we are seeing a restructuring in a way that is going to be more positive, because we have never before seen such a pile up of planets. I mean, we have, but only in intervals of thousands to thousands of years. So they represent things that only happen specific moments in time when we really shift consciousness. Yeah. So this could mean at this point either way. It could mean that we are going for a more conservative approach, and that's going to be it for the next few decades, and we have to swallow it and see what we can adapt in. It's going to be harsh, obviously, but it can also go to where we hope for, you know, at least me in particular. I know there are people in this public probably that are not going to necessarily agree, and it's okay. But I see this more decentralized power dynamics as the more ideal for this Aquarian age, where people have the ability to equally interact, like nations could equally speak to one another and develop a more stable type of economic dynamics. You know, we see the rise in this new age of the cryptocurrency, right? Money that's not actually physical, giving you much more power of choice about what you want to do with that money and how fast you want to manage that resource, that power resource that you have. That does individuate power for people in our society in a more minute sense, in a more personal sense.
Yeah. So that's the Aquarius bit that we've got to look forward to. We've also got the final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction coming up. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think any of us have escaped the attribution of the virus to the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So we've got the next one coming up on the 12th of November. Has it got some other whammy to deliver, do you think? Or is it just going to be the peak of the third wave of the virus?
The peak of that wave. No, actually, we are already in this new wave that has been putting Europe in a lockdown, in a new lockdown. And here in Brazil, we have been seeing more of a stabilization, but we are still up there in the rankings, you know. So we still have a long way to go with this virus, and it's not something that's going to go away. But this feeling of pressure that we have been experiencing since Jupiter ingressed into Capricorn late last year, it's going to be less effective. It's going to wane as Jupiter conjoins Saturn in the beginning of Aquarius, and then goes off to separate from Saturn. Once it leads into Pisces, it's going to leave briefly in 2021, but once it leads into Pisces in 2022, to stay there for a bit, things should feel less restrictive than they have now, and then they will a little bit in 2021, but less than now. Early 2021 is still going to be restrictive, and we can fear a kind of a new wave, but less intense than we have been experiencing now. It could be without a total lockdown, as we have been seeing. But Jupiter in Capricorn now is still talking to Pluto, and you can see graphs like if you go to some other astrology channels, such as the Astrology Podcast, for example, they have been showing in their own material for the forecast of the month of November a specific graph. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Darren.
Archetypal Explorer.
Right. Yeah, I
That's
believe that was
the
it.
website, Archetypal Explorer, that Astrology Podcast has been using.
Right. Thank you. I believe that was it. So you can go and check that graph out. It matches really ominously the scaling up of the virus in not only in Europe but in a worldwide scale. And so you can see while Jupiter is building up this last of 3 conjunctions to Pluto, you can see the last and largest peak of that infection curve going up in that graphic. So that's the bit about Pluto and Jupiter and Pluto together this year. And really, when you look on all the clump up of planets that we had, not only these outer planets that are slower moving, that take like a year through a sign, which is Jupiter, for example. But when you see Mars going through Capricorn, Sun going into Capricorn earlier this year, when he had the public first being made aware of this danger of the pandemic by the Chinese government, which was in late December, early January. That's the Sun going through Capricorn. We had eclipses last year going through Capricorn when the virus actually started spreading. Yeah. When it's presumed that the virus actually started spreading. Saturn was exactly conjunct another point that causes eclipses in the sky, which is called the South Node. And they worked together for months. That was a large cycle that doesn't happen often as well. Right. So there are a lot of peculiarities in astrology that we generally look for in the sky to determine certain important events, but they don't usually happen at the same spot in the sky at once. You know what I mean? Yes.
And that's really what seems to have contributed to, as you know, I've been learning about astrology seriously for a year now, and what a perfect year to be doing it. Although it's almost like there is so much noise. How can you pinpoint one influence from another? And you mentioned the eclipses, and yes, you can tie the eclipses into the virus, obviously, because
very well, yeah. Actually, we started opening up where we became aware of the virus in the first cycle of eclipses this year. In the second cycle of eclipses this year, after everything developed in the next 6 months, we had the opening up of the businesses and the economy that they attempted to do. But now that we are mounting up to the next set of eclipses, we have this new wave coming to its peak with the Pluto-Jupiter conjunction again. And so you see how they are tied up. So yes, you can pinpoint certain points in time where these developments, these specific developments in the year of 2020 are going to happen, not only through the eclipses, which have their own particular narrative, but you can also look into the quicker moving planets. They are really the quickest moving handles in this huge clock that astrology is. And we have been talking so far about the bigger handles in the clock. But if you go to these smaller ones, these closer to home ones, they determine more mundane events, more current events that are determined by individual action or specific weather patterns that influence humans in a big way. We have been seeing these large forests burning up. Like Australia was on fire just last year, and we've kind of forgot that because of all the shit that has been happening this year, right?
Yeah, Siberia was on fire, I seem to recall, this time last year.
Siberia on fire. Brazil's Amazon is on fire. And not only Brazil's Amazon, but a large portion of it is in Brazil. It's to blame on our government, spoiler alert, but you see all of this happening in countless disasters environmentally, like countless, really. You just had one these days, like it was yesterday or the day before, that we had this earthquake. Where was it? In Europe?
Turkey.
In Greece and Turkey, that killed a bunch of people. Like, and that's not even like it's not even surprising in 2020 anymore, because we've been having so many of those. But that's what happens when you concentrate too much energy in one sign, and when you have these quicker moving planets activating those spots, as Mercury is right now, for example, and Jupiter is, and all of that, and Saturn, and
so Mercury's doing it by square at the moment, isn't it?
yeah, it's squaring Saturn while it's stationing direct. So Mercury, in one of the peculiarities of its cycle, it's squaring another peculiar point in the zodiac that has been active for a very long time, especially with Saturn, that has been hanging out there for a long time, for the last couple of months.
So you would put this earthquake on the Capricorn stuff as well, and not necessarily the Uranus conjunct the full moon?
Oh, it's all of it. It's really all of it. But you see how these specific scenarios that have been developing during 2020, they compose the 2020 dynamic in a very large way. They are going to mobilize society, and that's why they are tied into the Capricorn and Mercury bit here. But yes, that full moon conjunct Uranus could be more of the weather pattern that you would look for if you were trying to predict the weather with astrology, which is not my speciality at all. But yes, there are different ways to look at it. But the societal part, the Capricorn bit, is tied to it, that whole 2020 dynamic that we have been seeing developing, and how one more impact could mobilize society even further and radicalize people, and make people more aware of reality in a much more tragic sense. Let's put it that way. Saturn has to do with tragedy and harsh things that happen to people, so they are made aware of reality. Pluto just adds up to it,
right?
To put it gently.
So there's a cheerful note.
Yes. To go on a better note, it's almost about to end, and that's why I think it's good to be talking about all of this now, because we can look at it in retrospect and really have something to look forward to once these planets really shift into other energies and they're not so concentrated in one spot anymore. You're going to feel the relief after December, really.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm not looking forward to that point. I don't think there's anyone on the planet who wouldn't be looking forward to that point.
Right, yeah.
So you mentioned the personal planets. One thing that I remember is that Mars, it conjuncted all the Capricorn cluster, as Anne Ortley calls it, and then it squared them several times as it's having its extended staycation in its home sign. How has that
playing out?
Stirred the waters up, like you were saying. You were saying about how a sign was being agitating.
Yeah.
I'd imagine there is no greater agitator than Mars.
Oh yes, Mars actually, precisely, yeah, that's a very good point. Mars actually brought up the civil unrest parts, and how society has been unsatisfied with the response that its governments have been giving to the virus, in general, and to this health crisis. Especially in places where, like, there are places that dealt with the crisis very well, certainly, but there are very central places to the worldwide economy that have dealt with the crisis of the virus very poorly, really poorly, and they have had some of the worst developments with the virus crisis, such as here in Brazil. You have the United States, you have the UK, very large portions of people really angry about the whole scenario that's being developed.
We can both say we know a song about that,
Yeah. So the dynamic of Mars with that Capricorn clump has been that, and when Capricorn was activated by Mars earlier this year, when Mars first ingressed into Capricorn, was when Europe started going into lockdown. And by the time Mars conjoined Jupiter by the 19th or 20th of March, I think it was the 20th of March, because it was in the solstice, I remember. It was around 19th or 20th. It was around
20th,
19th or 20th, yeah, of Capricorn. So when they conjoined, that was the peak of the first wave in Europe, and it was the peak of despair for people that didn't know worldwide how to deal with that crisis, and that were very scared about the things that were happening. So a lot of fear. You can see Jupiter is not very well placed in Capricorn. I'm not going to explain too much, but it has something to do with something called planetary dignities, if you want to research more about it in the internet. So these planetary dignities, they really determine that Jupiter is not so well placed, so there is not much it can do in that Martian situation. And so Mars is an addition of fear. And what that fear causes in people is the reaction, you know, because fear in your body will determine if you're flying or fighting, you know.
Yeah.
And people are choosing to fight in 2020 in a lot of places, as we can see. And the Mars going into Aries in July, it was early July. Actually, it was late June 27th. When it went into Aries and it started this dynamic, we have seen these governments trying to hold on to their own perspective of power and to their own. They have been in denial, and the population has been more and more preoccupied about the future and how are we going to deal with this? How are these people prepared to deal with this? If they are telling us that everything is okay, when clearly we are walking backwards, which is a word for retrograde here in Mars is going retrograde, squaring all of those planets. So how do they want to go? How do they want to go forward here and saying that we are moving forward and being successful in their plannings when we are clearly moving backwards? And they are repressing us for moving backwards now. To move backwards now, you know, because they haven't been competent enough to do what they should have done from the start.
That's very topical for me, because as we film this right now, just last night, Prime Minister Boris announced a lockdown, and also announced to everybody that it'd be here at 5 o'clock and didn't turn up till 7 to tell us the lockdown that we by this point already knew was happening.
Right. Yeah.
We've been talking about how the presence of a planet or squares to a planet has been activating the Capricorn cluster.
Yeah.
Has there been any significant nice things like trines and sextiles? They're supposed to be nice, or at least are they only being nice to the Capricorn cluster and therefore enhancing that roller coaster energy that we've all been suffering from?
Yes. So the trines and sextiles could be actions that the government took to try and resolve the situation, and that for a time really put the population at ease. But once the Capricorn cluster is activated by square again, by any planet, you see something popping up in the news that's really disturbing, you know, and sets them back much further than they actually have progressed with their feeble attempts during those sextiles and trines, you know. But we also see with those sextiles and trines as a parallel, people having their hopes set up, and that's a good, you know, that's a good point to be, a stage to be in.
Yeah.
But that's to be destroyed once the squares are active and the oppositions are active as well. Again, you know. And not to be destroyed because life is evil, but because people need to pay attention to what's going on if they want their happiness to be long lasting. You know, it's really a call to responsibility and to really take responsibility and action, because Capricorn is a cardinal sign about taking action towards an improvement of the structure. It's taking action towards the improvement of the structure, this cardinal energy. That's what they're inviting us to do when they're energizing those parts of the zodiac. And so, yeah, the reliefs that we had this year weren't that long lasting. One of the trines that you can point out in that dynamic is the trine between Uranus and that whole bunch. It's not a trine by degree, but it's a trine by sign, which really shows how the previous square dynamic that Uranus had the previous decade in Aries is developing now. It is a trine, but it's a disruptive trine because it's Uranus and all that clump in Capricorn redefining structure. But it means that society is actually finding a means to renovate, to restructure, and to challenge whatever comes in the way of that restructuring that's necessary for those oppressed bits that are fearful and that are rising up against them.
So these are all, I mean, we're talking on a global, societal or mundane astrology level with most of this conversation, but it is very much actions that you can take home and answer the invitation to restructure your life, restructure your job. Well, let's talk about, I mean, jobs. Your job is probably getting restructured for you with the economy doing what it is at the moment. But there is that wonderful invitation to restructure everything, which is something that you can, I'm saying wonderful invitation, it's in the whole term of, oh, goody, another learning experience. But all of this action can affect people personally as well. So that is by house. Yeah.
That is by house. That's when you get into the more palpable and more personal level of astrology, which is my specialty, which is where I specialize myself now and study more deeply. It's where all those circumstances that we have been describing in the whole of this video affect you specifically. You're not going to get as specific a reading as if you were with your own natal chart and an astrologer, but if we can point out to you, for example, as we are going to, how by house you can expect those themes to manifest in your life in a material sense, in a more close to home kind of sense.
So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each rising sign, because that's what defines your houses. And we can have a look at the themes that have more than likely come up for you within this 2020. I don't want to use the word that you did, but I can't think of a better one. So the 2020 shit show. And or 2020 parade, maybe. But let's have a look at how it affects each rising sign as to what house that it's looking in, what may have happened and what we may still have left. If there's any final punches or final surprises that may come up.
So if you're an Aquarius rising, then that means Capricorn is in your 12th house. Yay! Well, the 12th house, as we have mentioned in a couple of videos prior in this series, it's not the most welcoming place in your chart. And since it's Capricorn, it is a very internalized sign. It could have been a couple of years that were very rough for you, where you were already isolated, even though we weren't in COVID-19 during most of the Saturn and Capricorn transit. You probably were isolated then already, because the 12th house really requires you to go within your unconscious, your subconsciousness, and to see what is buried there that still holds power over you and makes you afraid of maybe speaking your truth to people, you know? And here's what I want to get, because for Aquarians, I think it's much more about the focus on where they want to go from here with the Aquarius period, now with the Saturn in Aquarius, than what happened in Capricorn, really. Because what happened in Capricorn, they know it was a shit show. For them specifically, it was like, it might not have been the worst case scenario, but when I say shit show, emotionally, they are going to be really challenged by themselves. It's going to be like, why am I still struggling with this? You know? Why am I still in the same spot I felt I was in my worst periods? You know, why do I feel like I haven't progressed? But then seeing the actual progress, how far they went so far, how people actually value their work, how fundamental their stances and their actions, trying to keep themselves sane and on level during these last 2 years, has brought them, how far it has brought them. Of course, you'll have your occasional Aquarius rising that will be a doctor and therefore will work with hospitals and mental health institutions and prisons and all of that, those are 12th house topics. So if you have any of those subjects, prisons, imprisonment, hospitalization associated with these last 2 years, that could be a manifestation of the 12th as well, and all that transit there. So the activations that would have happened in 2020 would have brought to your attention more clearly what you thought you could deal with, but you can actually not.
So that's like the eclipses, the conjunctions.
Yes, and the Mars transit earlier this year as well through Capricorn, and now the square that it's doing from the third house. Is it the third? Yeah, the third house to the 12th. And that would have been like, did I have an accident? Or did I think, I was insisting that something I thought was so right and so given was actually really wrong? And how could I have gotten it so wrong? Oh, I learned it wrong in the first place. Where did I learn it from? Who's responsible for this? And taking your own part of the responsibility for the actions that took you to this place, and forgiving yourself for that, really. And also forgiving other people so that you can live in harmony in moments where people are not really being the best of themselves, and holding space for understanding that and being the bigger person, in the relationship. Sometimes it's a self-denial kind of thing, but sometimes it's necessary. And in these periods of 12th house activations, we see that they are more necessary than not, because we have to understand a lot of things that when we understand them rationally, if we hold on to how we wish they would have gone, instead of releasing forgiveness and just accepting that they weren't like that and just focusing on what is, that can actually harm you, and that can actually become a demon that haunts you, that possesses you. It's a trauma response, stimulus. So for Aquarius risings, they have been dealing with all of that. And now they're ready to really come into the world and say, I'm not dealing with that shit anymore, because I know what has put me in that position that I was before, that isolated myself. But now that I have spent this night dark of the soul in self-analysis and in deep reflection, I can finally see some of my personality re-emerging. And
so is this the back end of Capricorn that you're talking about, or as Saturn and Jupiter enter into the first house with Aquarius?
It's both things, because they are a transition. You see, Jupiter and Saturn is stationed direct by late September this year. Mm-hmm. And so you only have 3 months really, or less, until they enter Aquarius. So you're really talking about the back end of Capricorn period and the entrance into Aquarius as one thing. The whole transit through Aquarius will take Jupiter around a year, and for Saturn about 2.5 years to 3 years to finish. And we are seeing the beginning of that story, but what I am describing in this series is really the back end of Capricorn and the beginning altogether. So they can look forward to being more proactive, being more active in the world again. They have been through a tough period of isolation, maybe self-imposed, that they weren't so uncomfortable with, perhaps, some of them, if they had Saturn natally in Capricorn with Venus there, for example, as I know some cases, they might have actually experienced this in a more positive way. But now they are invited to show what that inner trip cultivated in them, and how it reflects in the new expression that they are going to be called to put forward, move forward in their life more prominently.
That's excellent news, and also just relieving news for the year ahead, or a couple of years ahead.
Yes.
Excellent. So in conclusion, none of us will be upset to see the back of Capricorn. It's been a hell of a time, but it's been a really, really special time. There has been cycles that have come to an end and obviously begun again. this year that have been hundreds and some thousands of years in the making, in the rolling, I suppose. We won't see Jupiter, Saturn and Pluto together again in Capricorn for at least 700 years. And that's also not counting the fact that, what was it you were telling me a moment ago, David, about the nodes? David can explain this far better than I can.
Yeah, no, it's a really special time, as you said, Darren, because there is no register in recent or even ancient history in the modern era of a period of time where we had this much activity in Capricorn so close together at once for such a prolonged period of time, including eclipses and Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto, like all of them together at once for a long time. So since this doesn't happen often, I cannot like really name ones where it happened. I think the fall of the Roman Empire, when it started falling apart around 540 something, you had some Capricorn activations that were interesting in that regard. But even that doesn't compare to the activations that we're having now. And I think that's due also to the kinds of technological advances and the kind of consciousness that those brought to us in this point in time that were never before experienced by any other generation in humanity, right? And so, yeah, it's really a special time. It's really a new thing that we are going through, unprecedented in history. So
we may think that we are lucky to be alive, and yes, we are lucky to be alive to get through to the other side of 2020, but we really are lucky to be alive right now, because we are experiencing things that so much of humanity has never seen and will never see. So on that, I suppose we do have something to be grateful for. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the show, David is a practicing astrologer. He is open for readings. I personally have had a reading from David, and I will never be without a David in my life for as long as I live from this point on. It was that good. So if you want to contact David for a personal reading, there is a link in the description down below for the Facebook page for this channel. Send me a message there and I will pass on David's details. David, have you got anything you want to say to the audience?
Yeah, just thank you guys for your attention, and you guys have been amazing. Such an attentive audience. You know, I really loved being here with you guys tonight. And yeah, cheers, mate. Thank you for having me in your channel and for giving me such a welcoming introduction. And yeah, thank you.
So have a great 2020, what little, thankfully, is left of it. And let's all look forward to 2021. And we'll see you later.